Thank you, Isaac. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. I didn't hear any shout back. And good morning, colleagues online. You're most welcome to this session. Our keynote speaker, who is going to talk to us about media and revolution in Idi Amin's Uganda, is none other than Professor Derek Peterson, who is an Rwenzururu Collegiate Professor of History and African Studies at the University of Michigan, USA. And I just want to add that I think in CHUS and specifically in history, Derek Peterson is a household name. And so, Derek, you're most welcome home. We feel you're really part of us. So Professor Peterson works on intellectual and cultural history of Eastern Africa. And he's written so much that if I had to go through his publication list, I would perhaps take 30 minutes. And so, because we don't have that time, I just want to say that Professor Peterson has 3 books that he's authored alone, and then there are 7 books that he's authored with others or edited books. And he's edited journal articles. He has about 27 book chapters, over 25 journal articles, and so much more that I really can't get into. But I just thought that I should highlight a little bit of what he's done that relates to Uganda in particular. He's worked, of course, on the archives project in Uganda, and specifically worked with the UBC archives to put up the exhibition on Idi Amin of the Unseen Archives, but we also had a book coming out of that. And then he's authored Ethnic Patriotism and East African Revival. Again, for those who have read, you know that there's a good chunk of sections in that book that relate to Uganda. He's written an article on Uganda in the 70s, The Politics of Archives in Uganda, Governing Religious Life in Idi Amin's Uganda, Collecting Antique Things at the Uganda Museum. He's written States of Mind, Political Vision in the Rwenzururu Kingdom, Western Uganda. He's written on violence and political advocacy in the Lost Counties, Western Uganda, Rethinking the State in Idi Amin's Uganda, and in the work of time in Western Uganda in citizen studies. And lastly, he also wrote a short article on Uganda's history from the margins. So like the Vice Chancellor said when he was opening this conference, Professor Peterson probably knows a lot about Uganda more than most of us here. With those few remarks, it is my honor to welcome Professor Peterson. Please join me to welcome our keynote speaker for the day.
Okay. Sanyuse nyo oku yimirira maso lero kumacha. Echisoka njagala kwebaza abatageka ba oluchiko luno, Dr. Kanakwa, Levis Mugumya, Edgar Nabutanyi, Professor Aichire, and Professor Bantebia. I'm extremely grateful to have been invited to give this talk today. It's an honor and a great pleasure to be here at this very distinguished occasion. It's also for me a good chance to thank colleagues in the history department for having acted as my intellectual co-travelers over the course of these past few years. There are exciting things happening in the history department, in the graduate program, and among the faculty by way of research. And I'm tremendously pleased to have been able to watch and to some extent participate in those happenings. Let me also thank my friend, colleague, and co-conspirator, Professor Andrew State, the Dean of Social Sciences, who's been my host, colleague, and intellectual co-traveler since his assumption of the of the deanship some years ago. Andrew is standing down from his position this year, and I just want to thank you, Andrew, for all of your help and support over the course of years. Thank you. So the talk I'm going to give today condenses an argument that my colleagues and I are advancing in an exhibition that opens on the 5th of October at the Uganda Museum, titled Uganda at 60, an exhibition of national history. The exhibition displays a whole variety of interesting things. We'll be putting on show previously unseen photographs, memorabilia, newspaper materials, archival clippings, and other stuff that illuminates the contested history of Uganda since 9th October 1962. There will also be a museum film, which my colleagues and I are actively involved at the moment in creating, which includes lots of interviews with eminent and important Ugandans involved in the making of this country. This exhibition is co-curated by Dr. Kanakwa, Dr. Edgar Taylor, and Dr. David Ngendo Chimba of UMU. And I would very much invite all of you to come. We're going to open the exhibition at 3 o'clock on the 5th of October, Wednesday that is, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and with a panel involving historicals who were there on the 9th of October at the Day of Independence, reflecting on what they saw, what they learned. So please do come. We'll, of course, be sending out more information as the day draws nearer, but this is what the poster, at least at the moment, looks like. The talk I'm going to give draws from part of that exhibition. The exhibition focuses on the, the marginal political movements that challenged the singular vision of national independence propounded by the UPC government. So I'm going to talk today about media and revolution, particularly in the 1970s, focusing here on the Rwenzururu kingdom. The people of Rwenzururu fought for 20 years to secure their political and cultural independence. During the 8 years of Idi Amin's government, Rwenzururu was the government of first resort for many thousands of Western Uganda's people. During an epoch of austerity, bad government, and widespread political violence, Rwenzururu's institutions commanded loyalty and motivated self-sacrifice on the margins of the Ugandan polity in a remote and inaccessible place. Here was a government that worked. How did a group of poorly equipped mountaineers create and sustain a rebellion against the tyrannical military government of Idi Amin? This morning, I'll focus on the media infrastructures and habits of mind that upheld Rwenzururu's patriotism. Over the course of years, Rwenzururu partisans learned to think critically about the propaganda emanating from Radio Uganda and other government media outlets. They would not be drawn, that is, into the propulsive campaigns that the Amin government launched. They encouraged people in the mountains to decode Idi Amin's broadcasts, to measure his rhetoric, and to see themselves as defenders of a specific, grounded identity. Why would I talk about Rwenzururu in a conference about the humanities and knowledge revolutions? No one involved in the Rwenzururu rebellion went to Makerere University. They were not reading political theory, at least not political theory in the conventional sense. Their acquaintance with the great canon of literature was slight, and for whatever reason, the Zoom thing has now interrupted my broadcast. Okay, there we are. So why talk about Rwenzururu? Most of the people involved in the movement were not very literate. There was no Rwenzururu literature that drove the movement forward, but that is in many ways the point. Revolutions occur as people measure their world as they experience against the world as they imagine it ought to be. Revolutions occur as people come to see themselves as partisans of projects that are as yet unachieved. as prophets of dreams as yet unhonored, and as patriots of homelands that are as yet unfree. The humanities is the ingrained habit of cultural and political criticism, and it's therefore the advance guard of political transformation. It's the handmaiden that ushers in the time of revolutions. In the study of Rwenzururu, we can see, I think, how people learn how to be free. So look, the Rwenzururu rebellion was the most successful, most sustained experiment in the history of local self-government in Uganda. Western Uganda's people have long practiced the art of not being governed. The summits of the Rwenzururu Mountains rise to 5,000 meters, 3,650 meters above the Toro Plains to the east, and over 4,000 meters above the Semliki Valley to the west. In colonial times, British authorities had relied on the Toro Kingdom, which is a lowland society made up largely of cattle keepers, to govern the rebellious people of the mountains. Toro aristocrats were confident in the superiority of their civilization, and they were, until at least the 1960s, generally unwilling or unable to see the people of the mountains, that is the Bakonzo, the Bamba, and other minorities, as possessors of a unique, credible way of life. But in fact, Toro was not a culturally homogeneous polity. The Bakonzo Life History Research Society was founded in the early 1950s. Its members aimed to give a history and a direction to the people of the mountains. Their moving spirit was a man named Isaiah Mukinane, who's going to be central to the story that I tell this morning. He was a school teacher and a political activist, and the first secretary of the Bakonzo Life History Research Society. The society aimed, as he said, to, quote, instill patriotism among the Bakonzo people and have them unite together. They conducted historical research in the mountains, uncovering evidence of a long and proud record of self-government. Their research led patriotic people in the mountains to regard themselves as inheritors of a history of struggle. The first mention of the term Rwenzururu in Uganda's archives, as far as I know, comes in the return address of one of Isaiah Mukinane's letters. In January 1962, Mukinane composed a memorandum to the committee that was organizing a new constitution for the Kingdom of Toro. He asked that minority groups, that is the Bakonzo and the Bamba, should be mentioned explicitly in the constitution as constituents of the kingdom. And he asked that the kingdom's administrative jobs would be open to people of any ethnicity. The return address, as you can perhaps dimly see from the screen up here, mentions a place called Rwenzururu as the place from which Isaiah Mukinane was writing. It's handwritten, as you can perhaps see in the upper right corner of this memorandum. This is the first time Rwenzururu appears in the archive, as far as I can see. Here we can see Rwenzururu as an idea and a project emerging, giving a name, that is, to a people who had previously been hard to see and hard to defend. By the end of March 1962, officials reported that virtually everyone in the mountains agreed that they should secede from the Toro Kingdom and form a new district. Some people, in fact, were willing to fight and die for this newly recognized homeland. In August, partisans burned 2 buildings containing the tombs of the Toro kings. In a parish near Mukinane's home in Kasolenge, angry partisans burned down a chief's house. A month later, people shouting Rwenzururu chased off builders constructing a road that linked Fort Portal with the highlands. By December 1962, the Toro Kingdom's government in the mountains had virtually collapsed as officials sought refuge in the lowlands. Most of the schools in the mountains were closed as the Toro teachers had fled. Milton Obote's new government declared a state of emergency and deployed the Uganda Army, and over the course of 3 months, police arrested 665 people accused of working for the Banyana Rwenzururu. There were very few pitched battles. Rwenzururu's struggle for self-government was largely fought through acts of defiance. A government chief described the situation in this way. Here I'm quoting from a report. People use obscene language in addressing the chiefs, which is against our customary law. They thoroughly despise us and tell us to pack our bags and follow our mukama. They have neither the respect nor the decency to abstain from abusing chiefs on the road in the presence of other people. During the night, these people stand on the hills and shout abuses at chiefs and tell them to leave. In those heady days, some people found it possible to see themselves as founders of an entirely new political system. By June 1963, Isaiah Mukirani was calling himself king of Rwenzururu in correspondence with other movement leaders. He and other supporters established ministries of finance and education, immigration, internal affairs, and health for their nascent government. There was a poll tax collected annually. Litigants stayed away from Uganda government courts and instead took their cases before courts organized by Rwenzururu rebels. By the latter months of 1963, Toro chiefs were reporting that the whole mountain was, as they saw it, virtually lawless. One of them described the situation by saying, "The whole area is infested with self-appointed chiefs and forest courts manned by self-appointed magistrates and justices. Law and order has completely broken down. Citizens are not free to go about their lawful business, nor are they free to think for themselves." In the archives of Kabarole district, there's a printed flyer produced by Milton Obote's government. It's a piece of propaganda, one of many leaflets that the Obote government distributed to convince mountaineers about the folly of rebellion. A Rwenzururu censor defaced almost every part of the leaflet. He crossed out the government coat of arms at the top, as you can see, writing, "It is cursed," with a red pen over it. He stamped the flyer with a Rwenzururu rubber seal, as you can perhaps see, and he crossed out the smiling portrait of Milton Obote. Over the photo, he wrote, "Mr. Obote, our enemy, go back to Longo." Rwenzururu partisans were rendering visible things that constituted the government of Uganda, pushing away infrastructures and media of all kinds. Grounded in their people's patriotism, Rwenzururu could command allegiance in a way that Uganda, as a government, could not. Here was an effective administration that could convert local people's support and energy into visible progress. In January 1971, General Idi Amin overthrew Milton Obote and ushered in the Second Republic of Uganda. There was exceedingly little free space in Amin's Uganda. It's not that government was particularly effective as an authoritarian state. It was rather that the political system was geared to the mobilization of commoners' passions and energies. Public space was compressed. It was almost impossible for anyone to stake out an independent position. Amin's government possessed, more or less by accident, an impressive media infrastructure. It happened that Amin came to power just as the engineers of Radio Uganda were completing a big expansion project that turned Uganda's radio broadcasting service into the most powerful service in Africa. Within a year of coming to power, Amin had at his disposal a singularly powerful means of addressing the whole population of Uganda all at once. And for Amin, the radio infrastructure was a critically important vehicle for administration. It allowed authorities to dictate to people in the provinces about how they ought to act. Dr. Edgar Taylor and I, some years ago, wrote an article in which we called the dynamics of government in the 1970s government by exhortation. That is, the Amin government worked by setting out agendas for Uganda's people to pursue and by insisting that Ugandans ought, as their patriotic duty, pursue the campaigns and agendas and initiatives that people in Kampala conceived. There were a great many goals to meet, endless campaigns to pursue, and a great many enemies to fight too. All through the 1970s, the Amin government created an ever-expanding list of enemies: Israelis, Uganda Asians, Kenyans, Pentecostal Christians, and a whole bunch of other people found themselves targeted by Amin's men as a result of their lack of, as the Amin government saw it, compliance with government orders. Some people responded to the urgency of the times with enthusiasm, sacrificing their energy and time to pursue the programs that Amin laid out. But most people responded, or many people at least, responded by keeping a low profile. That is, many people opted out. They lived off the grid, away from centers of power, outside the notice of officials, soldiers, and agents of Amin's state. Over the course of the 1970s, there was a dramatic disinvestment from public infrastructure of all kinds. Enrollments for schools dropped dramatically. Donations to churches likewise fell. There were determined efforts as people sought to live in places that were hard to find. By the late 70s, there were large communities of people living in remote corners in the Chibale National Forest, in Chisangi, and in the Rwenzururu forests. I don't have time to talk about this character, a man named Rwenzururu, who appears fleetingly in the government records. Mr. Rwenzururu had assumed a pseudonym and had left his home traveling on the road over the course of years, avoiding paying taxes by constantly changing his name. His life story is a kind of exemplary case in a larger life strategy that many people pursued as they tried to effectively stay out of the way. At the edges of the state, outside the supervision of government authorities, some Ugandans sought to govern themselves. This impulse towards self-government was a practical form of defense, born in some cases from local patriotism, that is, a fervent regard for specific hard-won freedoms. Rwenzururu's architects were the most successful, protagonists of life off the grid, as I've called it. Like other Ugandans, Banya Rwenzururu were obliged to tune in to state media, especially Radio Uganda. And they were outraged at what they heard. As one of them wrote in a letter to the Uganda government, "You are merciless to the people who you are betraying and destroying without even a broadcast." Their exclusion from the radio airwaves was a constant source of irritation for Rwenzururu partisans. As one of them wrote, 1973, "It's astonishing that the views," I'm quoting here, "that the views of Rwenzururu opponents were broadcasted on Radio Uganda while the true and reasonable documents of news from Rwenzururu reach you and they are never broadcasted." In leaders' view, the postal system, like the radio station, was conspiring against them. They were sure that unscrupulous postal clerks were opening Rwenzururu correspondence and destroying it. The king of Rwenzururu wrote to world leaders in 1972, "A lot of letters from Rwenzururu are often addressed to you, but most of them are opened and caught by the East African Post and Telecommunications staff, then thrown away. That's why," he said, "you don't get an idea of Rwenzururu's sufferings and ideas." The ordinary means of communication were closed to them. Banya Rwenzururu had to create alternate networks for information distribution. They circumvented the official machinery by placing their correspondence in the custody of a generality of people. There were a great many of delivery routes that worked their way around the EAPLT. That is, Banya Rwenzururu conventionally would tack letters that they wished to address to a specific constituency on the trees around marketplaces on the morning of market days as a means of getting attention and readership for people that they would otherwise find it hard to address. They also sometimes sent letters through the post. Here's the list of, the screen is probably not big enough for anyone to see this, but this is the list of people who are copied on a letter from 1972 from the Rwenzururu king. What's fascinating about this is that it's a list of people without any titles, without any addresses, that is, or postal codes, or any visible means by which to use the postal system to actually get the letters into the hands of the people who are copied here. And it's quite a distinguished list. This particular letter is copied to the Ministry of Public Service in Kampala, the chairman of the East African Community, the commanding officer of the Eastern Province Barracks, the Secretary General of the OAU and the UN, and others. But again, there are no addresses. This is not a letter that's meant to go, per se, through the postal system. It's as though the author of this bit of correspondence was sending out letters by broadcast, as if he were throwing seeds in a field and hoping that they would take root. How did this actually work? So I talked several times to the ex-prime minister of Rwenzururu, a man named Yolama Mulima, who told me that Rwenzururu leaders used to rely on students to deliver their correspondence to Kampala. For international correspondence, they would place letters in the hands of Uganda Airlines staff, who posted their letters when they got to foreign capitals to the addressees. They presumed that their missives, however indiscriminate in their addresses, however eclectic and slow the mode of delivery, they presumed that those letters would find their destination through the public spiritedness of strangers. Over the course of years, the Banyarwanda Rwenzururu were constantly searching for bigger frameworks in which to locate their emergent political order. They wouldn't accept the machinery of the Ugandan state, the postal system, the leadership, the infrastructure, as the container in which their community would live. Isaiah Mukirane first wrote to the Secretary General of the United Nations in November 1962, asking for a UN peacekeeping force to protect the Rwenzururu people against the government of Uganda. A year later, he called again for a contingent of UN peacekeepers who would, as he said, support the weaponless Rwenzururu Kingdom military against Milton Obote's regime. In 1968, the Banyarwanda Rwenzururu actually sent a delegation to the United Nations in New York. The delegation made its way to Kigali in Rwanda, where the Rwandans intercepted them and shipped them back to the Ugandan border. Here's a form of political engagement that sidelined the choreography of Uganda's official diplomacy. The archives of the United Nations are located in an anonymous, unmarked building in New York City. The files about Uganda are voluminous. They're full of details about the technical work that UN people were doing to advance Uganda's development in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. But nowhere in the whole UN archive are there letters or petitions from the Banyarwanda Rwenzururu. U Tant, Kurt Waldheim, and their colleagues might have received the correspondence sent to them from Western Uganda, but if they did, the correspondence was soon destroyed. And the same is true for other diplomatic archives that I've worked in. The British National Archives has no correspondence from Rwenzururu at all. Neither does the Library and Archives of Canada, the Israeli State Archives, or the US State Department Archives. The energy with which the Banyarwanda Rwenzururu pursued their engagements with international diplomats were not reciprocated with attention, support, or even acknowledgement. Why then did they keep writing to New York, Geneva, London, Nairobi, asking for support? It's because, ladies and gentlemen, the audience for the letters that these people wrote was not located primarily in foreign capitals. The audience for those letters was in Bwera, Muhokia, and Kasese, that is, Ugandan localities that the Banyarwanda Rwenzururu claimed to lead. All of their correspondence was carbon copied to Rwenzururu audiences and addressed in the CC line to Rwenzururu citizens, to Rwenzururu Kingdom government offices, or to other constituencies within their kingdom. Most of the correspondence was written not in English, but in Lukonzo. 30 years before Ngugi called on literature people to decolonize the mind, the Banyarwanda Rwenzururu recognized the power of elevating, defining, and using African languages for the purpose of advancing and defending political identity. Hundreds of copies of every letter were circulated in the mountains, and I know that chiefs and government officials of the Rwenzururu would regularly convene meetings where they would read out the letters to audiences who would listen to what was written and learn from it. The correspondence of Rwenzururu, in its exploratory qualities, was not really written for foreign diplomats. It was written for audiences like those in the mountains of the Rwenzoris, to audiences that is of indignant people who could hear what was written and derive from it lessons. And indeed, the correspondence is full of evidence and material that's meant to arouse indignation and inspire resistance. Professor Musisi talked yesterday about the politics of refusal. The Banyarwanda Rwenzururu knew very well how powerful it was to refuse the official account of history and of current events. Banya Rwenzururu invited people to question the facts that were laid out in Idi Amin's radio broadcasts and to think critically about official media. Let me just take one letter among many instances. I'm aware that my time is going. In 1972, there was a radio notice announcing that Idi Amin intended to inaugurate 2 district governments in Uganda's mountainous west. In a circular letter, the Banya Rwenzururu instructed their people to ignore the radio broadcast. They wrote, "You are hereby notified on how you should not comply with the ruling as announced on Radio Uganda on 29 August 1972. We have not been fighting for small parts or counties or districts, but we have fought in order to return the full powers of our government to ourselves." This and many other exhortatory letters were meant to remind people about the historical lessons of their decades-long struggle against oppressors of all kinds. This was a constant, that is, reinforcement to people's sense of political purpose. It hooked people into a narrative that ran against the government media. Here was an infrastructure and a system of media circulation that worked outside the official channels, challenging Amin's government and encouraging the habit of critical listenership. The most remarkable of the open letters that the leaders of the movement composed were drafted in the early 70s when Isaiah Mukinane's son and successor, Charles Wesley Mumbere, opened up a dialogue with President Idi Amin. Over the course of several years, Charles Wesley commented on public affairs, laid out his people's claims, and challenged Idi Amin's self-interested pronouncements about public events. In this collection of correspondence, the king managed to unmask the categories with which the Amin government worked, opening up the government campaigns to criticism, satire, and disagreement. The king first wrote to President Amin in May 1971, 4 months after the coup that brought Amin to power. The letter was typed and carbon copied to the United Nations, the Organization of African Unity, the editors of Newsweek and Times, and to a variety of Rwenzururu audiences. The king exulted in the overthrow of Milton Obote and congratulated President Amin on the funeral of Kabaka Mutesa II, which he'd organized, of course, in April 1971. But Charles Wesley's pleasure at the coup that brought Amin to power did not last very long. Early in 1973, President Amin had called on the Banya Rwenzururu to lay down their arms, in return for which they would be given amnesty. Charles Wesley saw this as an unwanted affront to the kingdom's sovereignty. He wrote to Idi Amin as follows: "You are restricted and strongly proscribed in your republican provisions from taking interventions into the Rwenzururu kingdom government affairs." And over the course of the ensuing couple of years, Charles Wesley Mumbere bravely laid out in a series of letters criticisms of the way that the Amin government was working to organize public life. Among other things, Charles Wesley undermined Amin's claim to be at the vanguard of the African Revolution against racism and apartheid. The Amin government said that it was dragooning Ugandans to serve as frontline warriors against oppressors of foreign governments, but Charles Wesley argued that in fact it was Idi Amin that was the oppressor, not the South Africans or the Rhodesians. As he wrote in a letter to President Amin, "You are going to command and send barbarian armies and air forces to hunt and start to death Rwenzururians and expel them from their country, disturbing them just as Europeans are still disturbing Africans in African countries, like Rhodesia, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, and Guinea-Bissau, who have done no errors in Africa except they were fighting for their liberty." Charles Wesley was turning the tables on Amin's government. The Ugandan war against the Banya Rwenzururu, he argued, was like Ian Smith's war against the black Zimbabweans, or the apartheid state's war against South Africa's black nationalists. It was an assault on independent black people's way of life. In his correspondence, he always sought to buttress the courage of Rwenzururu partisans. Here's another letter from March 1973. Although the Uganda Army and Air Force can come to capitulate on land and in the air with air bombs and army equipments, we shall not surrender. Threat or leave our motherland, Rwenzururu. Our heavenly God will conceal us in extremity caves where no one can see, and your army will be straying off of our sight. All Rwenzururian mountain spirituals and God's host with sharp swords will fight, repel totally, and cool off your arrogant army. Life off the grid, according to King Charles, was a life of independence and freedom. The very geography of their homeland in the mountainous west set them beyond the reach of Amin's government, making it impossible for the military or its technology to subdue them. I interviewed Prime Minister Yolamo Mulima on several occasions in the late 2000s. Yeah, I'll be done in just 5 minutes. As a younger man, Mulima had helped Isaiah Mukirane conduct the research of the Bakonzo Life History Research Society. In the 70s, the research findings of the society were kept in typed hardcover files locked in a wooden box in the mountainous capital of the Rwenzururu insurgents. As Prime Minister, Yolamo Mulima had the only key to the box in which that archive was kept. And on occasion, he told me he would remove the research findings from the box and dry the papers in the sun as they became damp with the mountain's mist. Those were the originals. But there were copies, ladies and gentlemen, dispersed throughout the mountains. In every chief's office, there were files of historical papers, memoranda, research notes. It was a way of ensuring that the historical record of struggle would not be lost to posterity. Here was a decentralized economy of information. Engaged in a struggle over meaning and narrative with Idi Amin, the Banyad Rwenzururu relied on the expertise, knowledge, memory, and commitments of its people to marginalize the official account of things. The kingdom was led by unlettered and uneducated people. They didn't have a radio station. They didn't have an address book that was full of postal addresses, full of powerful and influential people. They didn't have firearms. At the time Amin came to power in January 1971, the Uganda Kingdom military possessed only 13 firearms. Most Banyad Rwenzururu soldiers drilled and fought with wooden guns like the man in this picture is carrying. It was an unequal, in fact, a ridiculous military contest. Amin's government was master of the airwaves, and President Amin stood at the head of the best equipped military in Africa by the later 1970s. But in the contest over historical narrative, Rwenzururu could rely on the memories of its people. The lessons of history, clarified out of the research done in the 1950s, taught the mountain's people to see themselves as engaged in an ongoing struggle against oppression. And in their archives, they had stored a paper record of their campaign against the dictatorial governments of Milton Obote and Idi Amin. Here was material they could use to highlight the hypocrisy of Uganda's leaders, comment on their failures, and expose their posturing. The Rwenzururu kingdom was to outlast the presidency of Idi Amin. In 1978, as the Tanzanians invaded, the Banyad Rwenzururu seized several trucks full of weapons that the Amin soldiers had abandoned. By 1980, in May, the Banyad Rwenzururu were effectively in command of Kasese town as the administrative center of what was then Kasese district. Actually, it was Rwenzori district at that time. By 1982, Rwenzururu's king had come down from the mountains and become a private citizen of the state of Uganda. A great many dissident organizations campaigned against Idi Amin's government. They authored petitions, exposed abuses, published stinging exposés, and shaped international opinion. They worked from Nairobi, from Dar es Salaam, or from London. Some of them were high-minded, idealistic, and entirely commendable groups who were to play a role in the political life of Uganda after the fall of Idi Amin. In history books and in autobiographies, it's those people who worked in English in centers of media around the world who were to make themselves the faces of the struggle against Amin's government. Within Uganda, though, let me remind you, there was only one political organization that sustained resistance to Amin's government. That was the Rwenzururus. Over the course of years, Rwenzururu brokers created and nurtured an information infrastructure that demystified official propaganda and set Idi Amin's tyranny at a distance. Here was a pedagogy of the oppressed. It elevated the historical experience of exclusion into the foundation of a separate state. In a small place and in a difficult time, Rwenzururu people built a kind of freedom. Today, Charles Wesley Mumbere, Omusinga of Rwenzururu, is under house arrest in Kampala, detained since 2016 when he and his colleagues were arrested at the palace in Kasese in an assault organized by the Uganda military. I met a few months ago with his wife, the Queen of Rwenzururu. He has diabetes, he's not well, and his health is failing. It's not my purpose here to offer an account or a view on the rights or wrongs of what happened since 2016 in Kasese district. That's not what I'm trying to point out. My point is simply this. The Banyarwenzururu are among the heroes of modern Ugandan history, and most Ugandans don't know anything about them. Over the course of 2 decades, in a remote place, they organized a political and cultural campaign to claim recognition, rights, and power on behalf of a previously oppressed and marginal community. Their bravery, frankly, and their activism helped to bring down Idi Amin's government. Other Ugandans, in my view, ought to regard Charles Wesley Mumbere and his people alongside other makers of modern-day Uganda. In my view, he deserves our respect, our honor, and he deserves his freedom. Thank you very much.
Wow. I think let's give Derek another big round of applause. Thank you so much, Professor Peterson, for that very fascinating talk. Usually there's no time for Q&A after keynote addresses. But I want to borrow from the keynote speaker of yesterday the concept of refusal to break that normative and allow for a few questions, because this topic is very, it's very fascinating and it's very, very revealing. So I'll ask someone with a mic, please. Okay, so I'll take a few questions and then we'll give Professor Peterson a moment to respond. So. There's someone at the center, Naume, yeah. And then there's another hand down here. So if we have 2 people with mics, it would help. There's someone else down here at the front. Naume, please go ahead. Introduce yourself, just your name, department, and then
Thank you so much. I am Naomi Namanya from Religion and Peace Studies. And thank you so much for the presentation. I don't know if I missed it, but I would like to know the origin of Rwenzururu as in a word. Is it related to the people in Rwenzori? Is it related to their culture? Is it related to their area? What is it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Good morning. First of all, I would like to give a thanks of gratitude before anything else for this conference.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Shabo Marion. I'm a subject of the Rwenzururu Kingdom. I'm a Mukonjo by tribe, both mom and dad. And I have constantly researched to know more, especially after what happened in 2016. A lot of us lost friends, family, relatives. People are still locked up. And I interested myself in knowing what is it really about? Why is it seems that particularly our tribe seems to be alienated and maybe persecuted? Because from when I was young, I used to hear stories about the Rwenzururu struggle and our fight from oppression by the Toro Kingdom at that time. But also what I did find fascinating is that for something, a struggle that took so long, there seemed to be little information about it, and everyone kept on asking. I think 2016 was like the highlight, and people seem to know nothing about this struggle. And I'm amazed today to see that actually there is documentation, there are letters. There seemed to be even a struggle during Amin's time. Though I'll tell you that some people in our kingdom do think that among all the presidents of Uganda, Amin was one of the few that actually interacted with the kingdom and went as far as even setting up infrastructure within the kingdom. So there seems to be sentiments of, Amin is the only one who ever cared to do anything about. I'm shocked that actually even him, he did some bad things that the kingdom really did not appreciate. So I'm quite grateful to you for the wealth of information that you've given us today, especially as a young Mukonjo woman. I'm so proud of my history today. But then it will point me to the question that I have as a Mukonjo. Where does it all lead? We have had a history of struggle, years and years, and up to now we are still in that struggle, and it seems that we might never be part of this thing called Uganda. And Ugandans might never feel connected to us or our struggle, though we have been part of theirs. We have been part of their struggle against Amin, we have been part of their struggle against Obote. But for some reason, when it comes to us, we seem there is no attachment, there is no feeling for us. And perhaps it's not only me, maybe other tribes feel that way. Will we ever be part of this thing called Uganda?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have a mic here, please? Professor State? Oh, okay, so Professor Kimba, and then we'll get to Professor State. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Peterson. I'm actually extremely impressed. But I note that you have access to a lot of privileged information, which we don't. And that explains why many of us still ask basic questions. And I would like you to assist me with some of the basic questions that many Ugandans ask about the Rwenzururu movement. Namely, what exactly do they want? Do they want to be do they want to be an independent nation? And do they want to be an autonomous region within a united Uganda? And then the other question is about the Rwenzururu outside, the Bakonzo, the people who associate with the Rwenzururu movement outside of Uganda, especially in Congo. Do the Ugandan Rwenzururu people view themselves as part of a greater Rwenzururu, kingdom that will one day be united and form another state around the Rwenzori Mountains? These are questions that puzzle us a lot, but I want you to return to the first one. What exactly do they want? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Kimba.
Thank you very much, Chair. I had, before Professor Kimba stole my ideas, I had the same question, but I rephrase. Yes, thank you very much, Derek, for this exciting talk and for new insights into this kind of defiance or resistance. Now, in your research, did you kind of find out whether the concept of nationalism or nationality of the Wakonzo people kind of resonate within the resistance. And secondly, how do you see it in terms of transboundary, the colonial boundaries set up? And that again relates to what Professor Kiyimba just asked. Do you see the Yira Republic emerge from your research findings of the 1960s and 1970s, but only reflects the Ugandan context? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to take 2 more questions. So that, and Christopher will be the last. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Madam. Thank you, Professor. I'm called Tamale from Lumumba Hall, Mackay University. My question is there a difference between Buganda and Uganda? And let me ask you this in Uganda. Waliwo enjawulo wa Buganda ne Uganda? Because for us, we have Uganda anthem. There's someone talking about saintism. Yakyogedde, kankyogere mu Luganda, okwawula yawula. For us, we are Baganda. Nze nazaalibwa mukazi mu Nyankole naye ndi Muganda. Is there a difference between Baganda and Buganda? Or Uganda and Buganda? Is there a difference? Because for us in East Africa, we have 5 countries. We have Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. But we don't have any difference. So, Mr. Muzungu, Professor, mbadde njagala onnyinyonnyole nga nze Tamale azaaliwo e Kasubi.
Thank you. Your question is clear. Okay. Okay. Okay, so please quick. I thought you had changed your mind. Yes. Okay, so that will be the last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Sebuyunga Christopher, a student, MA in the Department of History, Archaeology and Heritage Studies. I must confess today that I've had a different feeling from your presentation, coupled with some experience with the paper we actually read in one of our courses. When I was seeing some of your pictures in your presentation, as somebody who is passionate about photography, I'm very keen. And I'm wondering who those guys were taking pictures. Were they coming from government institution? So do we see a collaboration in the fight from the government institution itself? For example, if they were coming from UBC, and what could that mean to you in that kind of struggle? Another question is the question of the Basongora, which actually are coming from the same area of Rwenzururu region. And I am aware that this community is coming up to say they are also a kingdom, they are also a culture, and they also have a king. They have documented themselves, and they are asking for their recognition. And they are recognized as one of the minority groups, even in the constitution. Do you think we can see history repeating itself with this group as well? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. No, I won't take any more questions. I'll give opportunity to Professor Peterson to respond.
Working, I think. Okay, right. So first, I was asked about the origin of the term Rwenzururu. As far as I understand it, I don't speak Lukonzo, but so perhaps colleagues or friends from the Rwenzoris could be clearer on this than me, but I am given to understand that the term, based on archival materials, is almost entirely made up. It's derived from the term Rwenzori, which refers to the mountains, of course. But like other terms of political importance, like Mau Mau, for example, which is equally a made-up word, Rwenzururu is a term Rwenzururu is a term that Mukirane seemed to have invented to carry the purpose that I laid out in the talk here, that is to name a political community that was inter-ethnic, so he didn't want to call it the Bakonzo Rebellion or something like that. He wanted a term that supervened the Bamba and the Bakonzo, and indeed other minorities like the Basongora. So he came up with a term that didn't exist, but that could serve the purpose of naming a constituency that represented minorities who had been excluded from the Total Kingdom's constitution. The fact that the thing is born, the term is born, in January 1962 as the relationship between the Total Kingdom and the Ugandan state was being clarified in the eve of independence is important. It's a politically useful term that gives Mukirane a vehicle by which to name an inter-ethnic, multilinguistic community of people that deserved political recognition, not on the basis of ethnicity, but on the basis of their shared marginality. That's what's so remarkable about the Banya Rwenzururu. They don't, until relatively later in their history, in the 60s, it was an avowedly and purposefully multilingual and indeed multicultural rebellion, grounded not on Bakonzo, although the Bakonzo were predominant, but it was purposefully engaged with drawing the disparate people of the mountains together. I was asked by my second questioner about where the information about the Rwenzururu insurgency can be found. Let me first suggest that anyone who's interested in this subject should go off and read Arthur Shahuka Muhindo's remarkable but largely unknown book about the Rwenzururu freedom struggle. Shahuka Muhindo was a lecturer. He retired here from Makerere. He's a brilliant scholar who wrote a sort of an analysis of the Rwenzururu rebellion that was deeply informed by the thought of Frantz Fanon. And he was also to play a key role in helping argue the case for the Rwenzururu kingdom's recognition after the events of 1993, when the other kingdoms were recognized. So Shahuko's book was published by the CBR in the 1980s, and it's a brilliant study based on historical research. The documentation, to answer the question that a couple of people asked, comes from, largely for this talk, it comes from the Kabarole District Archive. So here I'll just briefly tell a story that is kind of inspiring. The Kabarole District Archives were salvaged from the attic of the government headquarters in Fort Portal about 12 years ago, where they were exposed to water and bugs. Myself and colleagues moved them into the campus of Mountains of the Moon University, which was then a new it was a new, rather local government institution in Fort Portal. And since then, MMU staff have digitized them, cataloged them, and cared for them with the support of this under-resourced provincial university, creating a digital archive that is, in fact, the largest digital archive of government documents in Africa, and it's at MMU in Fort Portal. MMU is the custodian of the largest digitized archive of government documents in Africa, and it's this amazing story. It's not accessible on the internet, so to answer your question about how you access them, all you need to do is to go to Fort Portal, knock on the door at CADS, the Center of African Development Studies in Lake Saka, outside Fort Portal town, where the archive is now located, and you'll be given access to the paper archives and, if you want, the digital archive. We don't have an internet access point for the digital archive because that is not allowed under Ugandan law, but the ministry and the local governments concerned have been happy to allow the digitization of several district government records, archives for the purposes of preservation. So that's where all these records are located, and they're as open to any Ugandan researcher as they are to me. And in fact, it would be lovely if students made use of them, as in fact many people at Mysore and in the history department here have done. Where does all this lead? What do the Banya Rwenzururu want? That's not really for me to address. As a historian, I can simply say that the Banya Rwenzururu are and always have been divided in their political ambitions. There always have been leaders of the movement that were effectively liberals who wanted a more open and more multicultural government for Uganda in the mountains. They were led by a man named Yeremia Kawamara, who was the leader of the Rwenzururu insurgency in Bwamba and who's one of the kind of great liberal thinkers of Western Uganda's history. He argued that effectively what the Banyarwenzururu wanted was a separate district, recognition for their language and culture in the Ugandan constitution, and he was quite happy after Kasese and Samliki district were recognized by Amin's government in 1974. By contrast, Mukirane and other insurgents in the mountains were not so much interested in a separate district, but wanted an entirely separate kingdom. After 1982, they laid down those separatist ambitions, and Charles Wesley quite happily became a citizen of Uganda, went off